Oh, wait a minute. Am I muted? Hold on.
Let me know when you want me to start sharing your presentation, okay?
Yeah. Yeah, you could start it now.
Okay.
I hate to stop looking at all these beautiful faces, but I think I need to look at the slides. You too, Vito. Yes. You're beautiful too. Okay, so we're going to have some slides now. We're sliding into the presentation. You got to go back.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I see it. I don't see me. Am I supposed to see me? I don't need to see me, but just wanted to.
You're not supposed to see yourself, but you can, if you can see your slides.
Okay, so it seems weird. Okay, no, okay, that's good. Okay.
Let me just mute myself here.
Okay. So you can hear me. Is this working? Testing 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, now it says. Você está apresentando para todos, but the slides have disappeared, and all I see is now slides. Okay, slides. All right, let's leave this up, Diogo. I'll tell you when to go to the next slide because I want to introduce this. So all this started in Brazil. So I was a lawyer for the U.S. government, working in the foreign aid program called USAID, and I was sent to Brazil in September of '64 to help the new government. The new government, which government was that? You'll remember this government wasn't exactly democratically elected, but it was a government, and we thought it was great. The American government thought it was a great government. They probably had helped elect it, quote unquote. We won't go into that, but there's plenty of history for those of you who want to know the role of the American government in the coup of 1964. Its bloody hands were all over the coup. I was a very young lawyer, just a couple of years out of law school. And so this was an incredible experience for me to come to Brazil, to be the chief lawyer for a program that in today's dollars was transferring about $3 billion in today's money a year to the Brazilian government. And it was a very exciting part of my life. And in this job, I worked for all the other people in the development agency who were making loans, and there was I don't understand, this thing is moving around, but you can hear me, right? Okay, I'll keep my eye on Raquel, who will keep me honest here. So there I was working as a young lawyer. I was in my late 20s, and everybody, there was an agricultural development office that I worked with, and there was the business development office, and there was the capital development office, and there was the educational development office. In this US government mission, there were all these different development offices. And I said, well, where is the law and development office? And they said, what are you talking about? There's no such thing. So that's how it all really got started. I thought, well, law must have something to do with development. I mean, why should law not have a role and agriculture have a role? It didn't seem fair. I thought law was a pretty big deal. So when I went back to Washington to talk to my boss, who was the senior lawyer for Latin America, I said, why don't we have law and development? And he said, yes, that's a good idea. We should do that. And so bunch of us inside this agency started talking up the idea of law and development. And that's really how it started. as an instinct within the U.S. government of a bunch of lawyers who were sort of frustrated with not being on the development map, not having law on the development map. And we, as you will see later, we managed to hook up with, and some of us, as I did, became academics and get started a debate about law and development in the American academic scene. Now, this was the Cold War. This is a Cold War project. It's extremely important to understand the extent to which the whole law and development enterprise started as a Cold War development. The United States was worried about the spread of communism. That's what's behind the coup, American support for the coup. How, whether that was a realistic fear or not, many people, myself included, would question, but that's what they thought at the time. They were afraid that somehow the Cuban model would be picked up in Brazil, and all of a sudden all of Latin America would look like Cuba, and they didn't want that. So, and that the Russians would then move in, or the Soviet Union would move in, and then we would have lost Latin America to communism. That's the way people thought in those days. Okay, so you have to understand law and development as it emerged in its early days in this context. Okay, so let's go to the first slide. Okay, so it was, I call this an emancipatory vision because as it was framed in its idealistic sense, it was indeed tied to a vision of a vision of emancipation, albeit a Cold War vision of emancipation. As I said, it started as an adjunct, the academic field, and now we're shifting to talk about the academic field. Started in the 1960s as an adjunct to the development assistance program. As you see, those of us who were working in the program felt that we needed to have some intellectual purchase on the role of law and development. And we helped get universities involved in the business. And AID gave big grants to Yale and Stanford, and the Ford Foundation gave big grants to Wisconsin and other places. And those were where the academic program started in the United States. Now, what did development mean? What did development mean in this time? This was a time in which development policy emphasized the role of state-led capitalism and assumed a very major role for the state in the economy. This was felt to be a necessary way to get development and industrialization or modernization or whatever you want to call it, started in countries that had not really developed strong industrial sectors, that the state had to take a leading role. And law was a way to both help programmatically with that goal, but also to symbolize that American foreign policy, American development aid was concerned for fairness and equality and democracy. Well, not so much. And the rule of law, whatever that was. And that's kind of the rhetoric, and the rule of law played an important part in American foreign policy rhetoric during the Cold War. You know, of course, in the Soviet world, they had May Day, and we had Law Day. So Law Day was that was Law Day. We did Law Day. We didn't. All right. So that sounds good, and that's good. We're exporting the rule of law and fairness and equality, but we weren't. We weren't. The programs focused on economic policy, on purely economic policy, and public law to strengthen the state's role in the economy. That's what the early programs were. So there was a disconnect between the rhetoric, freedom, equality, rule of law, democracy, and let's, empower the state-owned enterprises in developing countries, which is what one of the kinds of things that were done. So this is how law and development got started. Started as a self-conscious enterprise. You can date it to the late 60s in America, fueled in very substantial way by, as I said, both the Ford Foundation, which was a very important institution initially, and then the US government came in a massive way and gave, for example, grants of $1 million to Yale and almost as much to Stanford universities to develop the rule of law, the field of law and development. Now, $1 million in 1968, when Yale got the money, would be worth what, $10 million today? That's a lot of money to be thrown at a university with no strings attached, by the way. That is, we don't know what law and development is. You guys figure it out. You're smart, you're Yale. I literally, that's what they did. Since I was the one who was running the program at the time at Yale, I know this. Okay. We drew at that, so here we are, a bunch of lawyers, maybe, and people who are, able to something just happened. Okay. Hold on, Diogo. Okay. Now go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. No, go back. I'm sorry. Excuse me. They're a little clunky because I don't know how to do the slides and Diogo's doing it for me. Okay, so what did we know? We didn't know anything. I mean, we knew, how to draft a contract. We knew property law in the United States. Maybe we had taken a course in comparative law and we knew something about the civil law tradition, but we didn't really know anything about anything. And we knew all the books. We read the books about development. We knew about economic development. We read, and so we had to sort of learn from scratch. So law and development started from nowhere except a Cold War vision of the role of America in the world, and an effort to tease out from that an understanding of law and what law might do to help that vision. That's where it came from. And we had to teach ourselves sociology and economics and history in order to do that. And I actually spent 2 years trying to understand what Max Weber thought about law, and I think I figured it out, but it took me 2 years. So that was the early days. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this came out of a period in which the official aid agencies were very much committed to state-led growth, but people began to question that. So the first law and development, or what I call L&D 1.0, was critiqued first for its dependence on state-led growth rather than a focus on championing markets. And the economists said, why are you worried about the state? Let's get the markets to work, and law must have something to do with that. But we don't know what it is, so you figure that out. The lawyers said, wait a minute, all these programs in law are aimed at fostering growth, but whatever happened to democracy and equity and the rule of law? And then the scholars said, wait a minute, do we trust these agencies? Do we really think that this is, this is a foreign aid, this is a foreign policy game, this is politics, and we're not completely sure we agree with the way the development agencies are defining things, and we really should be autonomous and be a real academic field. And out of this critique, there began to emerge a new vision, but also a critique of that vision. So now we move into the next stage in which the critique of law and development 1.0 leads to a new vision. That's the pillars of the new vision on the left. And then people like me, troublemakers, start criticizing that. So this is kind of complicated. Okay, but it starts with the pillars of the new vision. Okay, so the economists and those who accept their perspectives say, okay, what we've got to do is not empower the state, we've got to restrict the state because the state is making a mess of things and only the market knows how to do things right. So we've got to limit the state role and increase the capacity and role of market institutions. And by the way, we don't want to have these individual national economies. That's terribly inefficient. We want an integrated world economy where, some people will produce products for the whole world, and this is trade theory pushed to its economic theory of trade pushed to its logical conclusion. And this was important. Maybe developing the economy doesn't automatically lead to democracy, rule of law, and equity. So if you want that, we better do a little bit about that too. But it was not, it was in the second tier of the vision, not the first tier. The first tier was strengthen market economy, create an integrated world economy. Okay. So that's kind of what grew up as a development vision. And their law was given two tasks: strengthen market institutions, and then as a separate thing, figure out how to promote democracy, rule of law, and equity. But that was not the priority. So but this takes off. This becomes very important because this vision, what I call the new vision, is adopted by the World Bank, and which then influences all the development agencies in the North, and of course, therefore, has tremendous impact in the global South. So naturally, a critique of this emerges. And I'll just give you a few highlights. So scholars said, wait a minute, you've got this all wrong. Sure, markets are important, but the state continues to play a very important role, even in an economy where you're trying to give a greater role to the state. And the more you restrict the state, the less you will get the kind of innovations that are needed. Then the critique of the integrated world economy says, well, wait a minute. This sounds great in theory, but what it really does is strengthen global capital and its domestic allies, therefore affecting the internal politics and policies of the countries that are following this vision. And there was a strong critique of the law and democracy promotion efforts, which, remember, have been set separately from the market development and the economic development agenda, because they are suggested to be more window dressing than deep commitments, and they're there to legitimize the restructuring of the world economy and the domestic political systems that are embedded in it, rather than truly promoting freedom, equality, and all that. So that was the critique. And so that's kind of the vision, and let's give a period to that. Let's say this is, by now we're into the 90s. We're into the mid 90s. Okay. So out of this complex world comes what I'm going to call Law and Development 2.0. Slide. So the first thing is that all of a sudden, law and development, which was kind of a minor activity, relatively minor activity within the foreign aid world, and to some degree, it was a private project of individual people in the agencies. When I was in Brazil, I came to the conclusion that one way to modernize law and have more development-friendly law was to reform legal education in Brazil. I've written about this, and Diogo knows all about this. You can find lots of articles. By the way, if you're interested in any of my work on this, if you go to the University of Wisconsin, my bio page at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and go on publications, everything is up there. Everything I've written about law and development until recently is available online through the University of Wisconsin and through my bio thing. So I'll just tell you that there's a lot of stuff there. So there was a huge change as the economists decided that law was important. I always say that it was the economists who made Law and Development 2.0. When the lawyers said it was important, nobody paid attention to them, or very little. And I was telling you that when I was in Brazil and I decided that I should try to do something about law and development, and came up with the idea of reforming law schools, I went to the head of the aid mission and I said, I think we should have this project on legal education, and I've been talking to people in law schools and they're interested in stuff like that, and I'd like to get a little money to help them out. And he looked at me and said, I don't know whether that really is law, I don't know. But look, Trubek, you're a good lawyer, and we really need you to manage the legal business of the agency here. So if you want to take $1 million, go see what you can do. This is a true story. And I did. And there's a whole book about CPED and all of that came out of that. But nobody believed that this was important, and you couldn't get it set as a priority until the economists decided law was important because markets were important and law made markets. And so there was a massive investment. World Bank, hundreds of millions of dollars started pouring in. And this was supported by the fact that this is the period of the globalization of the legal profession, about which I have written a lot, including about Brazil. And so you had business law people working across borders. And so North-South networks of elite North-South networks in business law grow up. And they get involved because they are trying to change the legal systems to benefit capital. But at the same time, because of this secondary agenda of democracy, freedom, rule of law, and the rest of it, you get a separate thing, which is the growth of tangos. Now, tangos are not Argentine dances. They are Argentine dances, but I am not referring to the spread of Argentine dances. A tango is a transnational advocacy NGO. And there's a whole world of them, and they do human rights, environment, women's rights, rule of law, all sorts of things. And this sector grew too. So now we have agencies engaged, we have the business law profession engaged, the tango, the NGOs get involved, and the academy, knowing where the money is, grabs hold of some of this money and grows again geometrically. So let's take the next slide. So this is the three worlds of NGOs, profession, agencies, and the academy. Now, the scale here, the relative scale is correct. That is, the agencies are important, the profession and the NGOs somewhat less important, and the academy less important, but the scale, the agencies should be like huge, the profession like not so huge, and the academy is a little tiny thing there. But I couldn't make the slide so it's important to understand, we're talking about agencies and governments that are, by agencies and governments, I'm thinking of international agencies like the World Bank. By profession, I mean the lawyers and the legal profession, the corporate, particularly the corporate profession, and NGOs, and then the academy is the academy. So that's the three worlds of law and development. As of the end of the 90s, Diogo, you think the end of the 90s, early 2000s, more or less? Okay. So somehow the slide has now gotten downplayed, but that's okay. All right, now, so as we go into the 2000s, although academic law and development is growing in terms of the number of people involved, the issues they look at, and all of that, it's also beginning to face a crisis. So let's look at this. We had growth, but with growth came specialization. And there began to develop a whole series of subfields. International trade law and development, human rights and development, and so on and so on and so forth. And so all of a sudden, where there was just one thing, which was law and development, there are lots of separate things that deal somehow. So development gets broken up into its pieces, and law gets attached to the pieces. So then within the fast-growing academic world, you're getting a series of distinct specializations, which fragments what was already a very, very loosely, poorly institutionalized area. There were no really dominant journals. There were very few really organized meetings at the transnational level in the academic world. The projects that had been funded earlier on were no longer operational, and the new round of research projects tended to be broken down into these various specializations, which became worlds of their own. So you had fragmentation, which was good in the sense that there were lots of things going on, but bad in the sense that they didn't come together to take a holistic view of where law might fit in a particular country or region of a country. That was the first problem. The second problem I call contextualization. So when the law and development started, it was a search for a bunch of universal rules and recipes that could be applied anywhere, because development was one thing, and you just, you know, look to the economists and they would tell you what development was, and then you would figure out what the legal rules were and legal institutions, and then that would, you know, then you could produce that and it would work anywhere. That was the, I hate to say it because I was part of it, that was very much the thinking in the very early days, that we could do this. But the first thing that fell apart was the faith that there was a single development model. As the economists began to look and say, look, development is a pragmatic enterprise of searching for innovative solutions that work within particular local conditions. The idea that there was a universal recipe for economic development, or development more broadly defined, began to fade. That idea, people lost confidence in that idea. And at the same time, we began to realize that legal systems, as we began to actually try out some of these transfers of laws from developing countries and other things that the first Law and Development 1.0 had promoted, and we see they didn't work locally because they weren't adapted to local conditions. Again, the context of legal systems added to the contextual nature of innovative development strategies undermine the faith that you could have a sort of single field with common understandings. And so that was the second thing that led to the crisis. And then hegemony. Well, as more and more people from the global south got involved in this field, it was a field that really started in the north about the south, but gradually the people from the south said, hey, wait a minute, you know, this is us. Why are you telling us what to do? Let's have our own stuff. And they did. But the North continued, and to this day still has a major role. The universities are better funded. The press, they have much greater prestige. If you want to be, you know, if you want to have a successful career anywhere, it's better to graduate from Harvard than to graduate from POE University, whatever. So people would go from the South, would go and study in the North, and then they would become part of global networks that were driven by senior people in the North. And this kind of siloism, they would get into these silos, and so this remained a field dominated by the institutions, an academic field dominated by institutions and scholars from the global North. That we are gradually chipping away at, but it still remains to be a problem. So that sort of, and I made this diagnosis. What you're looking at, these three slides, I mean, the slides with these 3 points, I made about 10 years ago. So about 10 years ago is when I think this was the problem. And since then, there has been some progress in trying to deal with this. But at this point, 10 years ago, it kind of looked like that. A little bit confusing, all over the place. It's a beautiful building, Law and Development is a beautiful building, but not quite so sure that it didn't integrate too well. Links, you can't see it. This says links and this says Rex. So that's my image of Law and Development 10 years ago. By the way, that's a painting by a Mexican painter named Pedro Friedberg. So you might enjoy that because he's a fantastic Mexican surrealist painter. And I own that painting. And wait a minute. Can you see this? Can you see this, Diogo? Yeah. So this is, it's on the cover of the latest book that I've.
We
okay.
see it.
Okay, good. So that's it. So that's Law and Development 10 years ago. Beautiful building, but a bit of a mess without much structure. Okay, so back to the slides. Okay, so how are we going to manage this crisis? Well, not so easy. The problem of hierarchy is simple. Build autonomous capacity in the global south. Simple to say, difficult to do, given the world hierarchy of universities, the differential resources that are available. All I can say is people are working on this, and that's been a project of mine. That's what I could say, that's what we're doing here. Okay, on context. Well, I have a paper on this, which is on my website. A lot of law and development work started by studying the laws of the developed countries. If you wanted to have a successful capital market law in Brazil, what did you do? You studied the Securities and U.S. Securities and Exchange Act of 1935, I think it was, and then you just translated that into Portuguese and took it from there. If you wanted to, have a contracts law, you'd go to France and study, because that's a civil law. You study French contract law, German contract law, whatever. We learned that wasn't very successful. This approach led to what were called transplants. The transplants didn't take in the não pegou, and so we came up with this idea that rather than looking at the most advanced countries that were very different in many ways, both legally and economically and politically, look at similar countries that have had some success and see if you could learn there rather than trying to copy systems that are very different. It's not a perfect solution, but I think we just have encouraged more of this. And then fragmentation, well, there's no simple solution, because the human rights people aren't that concerned with the capital markets people, who aren't concerned with the trade people, and yet all of these are part of law and development. But I think some efforts being made. There is a new network that got started in Northern Europe, and Diogo's been involved in it. It's called the Law and Development Research Network, right? LDRN. And this is an effort to sort of do all these things, build autonomous capacity in the global south, although they're not quite as good on that as they should be. Context, certainly they recognize that, and fragmentation, they do try to be open to all the different approaches that come within the very broad umbrella of law and development. So now it's your responsibility, not mine. I've done my work in law and development. I'm sitting back watching what Diogo's doing and Raquel is doing and all the rest of you are doing or will do. But I have a few thoughts for the future, and I have, by my count, 3 more minutes. So let me turn off my timer, because otherwise it's going to make a noise. Okay. So I think what's important as we go ahead is that we must maintain our commitment to democracy, equity, and the rule of law. This was an emancipatory project when it started. it sort of got caught up in Cold War politics and sort of lost its emancipatory vision, but we should go back or stay with that. It should be policy relevant. The knowledge should be useful and usable. It has to be interdependent. We have to take care of all the dimensions of a problem. It must be interdisciplinary. Lawyers alone cannot do this. Academics alone cannot do this. We must work with other disciplines. We must work with practitioners. And it's very important to be in transnational networks so that we can develop our ideas in the context of a broader environment. And I think that the Law and Development Network in Europe is the closest thing to that exists, and I'm glad it's there. I wish it was larger. I wish it was a little bit more I wish that the countries from the global south that are beginning to get involved in it, it started strictly as a Northern European project. I wish that they had a bigger role, but it's a start. And I think, you know, hopefully people like Diogo and others will carry it on. That's my speech. Over to you, Diogo.
Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Dave. That was great. You gave us a very relevant and important talk on the history of law and development as a field, as an approach, with very important theoretical references and ideas and hints. And we now have some minutes, couple of minutes, maybe 20 minutes for conversation. People can participate. People are more than welcome to participate and bring questions in Portuguese. Pessoal, por favor.
Yes. Yeah, let me say, vocês podem falar em português lentamente, slowly, né? Eu vou tentar de responder, mas eu vou responder em inglês, mas se vocês preferem falar em português devagar, tudo bem.
Muito bem. Obrigado, Dave. Pessoal, nós temos um tempinho para perguntas e respostas do professor Trubek. Dave, na primeira parte dessa aula, a gente teve uma discussão sobre desigualdade e desenvolvimento econômico, e estávamos aqui discutindo em que medida o direito cristaliza e perpetua desigualdades num país como o Brasil. E eu discutia com as alunas e os alunos da disciplina Direito Econômico, junto com a Beatriz e com a Carolina, e também poderia ter feito isso com a Raquel. Ela não estava ainda na primeira aula, mas na semana que vem a Raquel vai nos dar uma aula aqui nesse curso sobre corrupção e desenvolvimento, então também tem bastante a ver com essa agenda. A gente discutia em que medida o direito pode ser objeto de reflexão acadêmica e crítica na medida em que aumenta a desigualdade ou perpetua a desigualdade num país que já é muito desigual como o Brasil. Você gostaria de falar alguma coisa a esse respeito? Você concorda que... Pois, go ahead.
I don't think there's anything inherent in law in some sort of fundamental sense, whether it's going to promote equality or inequality. It kind of, law can and does do both. To me, it's just an empirical question in which areas and which countries, in which time frames, it's more a tool of inequality or more a tool of equality, or some mixture, as it is almost always. So I think this is strictly an empirical question that needs to be studied in an empirical way, you cannot say a priori the law, the whole law, is doing anything, whether it's helping equality or, you know, or raising the temperature, the average temperature, or stopping the average temperature from going up. It's just a thing that's there, and it does lots of things. And what it does in any one country will vary from that country to another, and it'll be doing more than one thing. So you will find parts of the law that are helping equality and parts of the law that aren't. And how you make a balance overall, I don't know, and I'm not sure it's important, because as a pragmatic question, what you want to do is say, okay, let's find the areas that where law is helping democracy or equality or whatever, and let's find the areas that it isn't. Let's find the areas which things that law is doing in this particular country at this particular time that are promoting inequality, and do something about that. But I don't think that it makes sense to frame the question in some sort of totalizing way and say, well, all law, you know, I mean, there are people who think that, after all, and there are many great authors and literary authors who've talked about this. As the famous French author said, the rich and the poor are both prohibited from sleeping under the bridges of Paris. So, right, so the law is treating the rich and the poor equally. Neither of them can sleep under the bridges of Paris, but obviously this is giving, you know, this is a critique of law's unequal effect. So the answer is, of course, I'm sure we can find 30 things in Brazil where the current laws are promoting inequality, and we can find 10 things in which it's doing the opposite. And the question is the balance, but I don't think there's a general conclusion. And I think doing anything about it requires you to break the thing down into very concrete and specific issues and then approach that. You've written about tax law. I know, Diogo, you've written about tax law and inequality, if I'm not mistaken, many years ago. And sure, that's, you know, that's an area that can be very unequal. And of course, the classic, and there's a and the law can be administered. The law may be fair on its face, but it can be administered. It's not just the rules, it's the way they're administered. So there's this famous article by an American scholar about why the better off and the larger organizations tend to win in lawsuits. It's called Why the Haves Come Out Ahead by Mark Galanter. This is being translated into Portuguese, or if it may have already been translated into Portuguese. That's an example, right? So the rules may be on their face equal, but if they work in such a way that they benefit the more powerful or the better organized, then they are promoting inequality. But I think this is an empirical question, not a fundamental jurisprudential question, and I think you have to approach it that way.
Yes, that's what we have been discussing, exactly the fact that this is an empirical, not that much philosophical, not only philosophical question. Dave,
the philosophical answer is that the question is empirical.
Yeah. So, Dave, Poliana Soares is asking a question here in the chat. To what extent do unilateral agencies such as IMF, OECD perpetuate inequalities between countries by imposing universal models? Do you agree with that?
I think that's a danger, and I think it's a continued danger. The IMF, I think that both the OECD and the IMF are probably a little bit better than they were in the past, but it's still an issue. Sure, absolutely. And there's endless literature on this if you want to follow it up. I mean, the short answer to your question is yes.
Excellent. Okay. Raquel, would you like to ask your question orally?
Sure. Dave, I was wondering if you could talk about how several countries around the world are facing some kind of democratic backsliding, Brazil among them, and how should this new, but not really that new, questioning of how authoritarianism shapes the law and how, you know, these countries are experiencing that, how they should be integrated or incorporated by scholars that are concerned with law and development. It's a very self-interested question.
I was going to say, Raquel, now the students don't know that Raquel and I are actually running a project to do exactly this. So we're just getting a little free advertising here. But seriously, I think this is very important. So there is a small but growing literature on how authoritarian governments use the law not to protect human rights, but to strengthen authoritarian rule. So it used to be that authoritarian governments would come in through coups. Oh, we heard of that. You may know a little bit about coups, right? You know about coups. And they would just simply get rid of the whole legal structure and then create some authoritarian version, you know. I'm sure anyone who's read the history of the '64 coup and the institutional acts and all of that, the whole structure. But that was done by a rupture with the constitutional order. But what is happening now is that authoritarians are figuring out how to get power without this rupture by diverting the legal structures into authoritarian channels. And this is happening around the world. Now, I think the first and most blatant version of this occurred in Hungary with Orban, and has been very carefully studied by scholars, including a political scientist and sociologist at Princeton named Kim Lane Shepley, who's written a very important article in the University of Chicago Law Review on this. Raquel and I, along with people from India and South Africa, as well as some American and European scholars who study this phenomenon, are developing a project. Now, this is a beautiful example of fragmentation, right? So we've got this whole group now, because this is a very specialized subject that requires knowing a lot about a lot of countries, some of whom you wouldn't have thought of as part of development, like Hungary, but there's Turkey, who's a perfect example of this as well. And this is the kind of thing that's happening within the sort of, and so what's important is to be sure that as we proceed with this project, we don't lose sight of the fact that this is embedded in a situation where other aspects of the role of law in these particular countries needs to be studied, its economic role and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, you can't study this without some depth and engagement. That's why the field fragments, because, you know, this is itself a complex thing. It has to be studied in several countries at once in order to get some broader purchase on it. It takes multiple disciplines. We have political scientists, sociologists, historians. We're trying to get involved in this, not just lawyers, because it's a much broader phenomenon and it can only be seen in this broader context. So it becomes a kind of big world of, you know, but then how do we be sure that we are in dialogue with the people who are working on trade law or working on, you know, capital markets law or tax law or whatever. So this is, you know, this is, and I think this is also an example of a transnational network. This is another thing I think that's very important in law and development today, is the need for these transnational networks that are South-South based. This network, which is run out of FGV in Sao Paulo, and involves groups in India and South Africa, is a South-South network in which there are a few people who are not from these countries who have some expertise in other countries that they're interested in, like Professor Shepley. But it is driven by, and the topic is defined by the key scholars from these three countries. And so I think that is a model that we can look at once it's up and running. It's just beginning to get started, but and then we can hold a meeting at the Law and Society Research Network, whenever they meet. Now, so let's just step back and look at what's going on here. I am looking at a bunch of people who are in Sao Paulo. I'm seeing them like they were in my next room. I talked to Diogo this morning. My wife I live in a 12-story apartment building in Brooklyn, New York. Because of the pandemic, people aren't doing much talking to each other, even in this building. So my wife is the chair of the board of directors of this building, because it's a cooperative. And when they have their board meetings, they talk on Zoom. And it's no different than I'm talking to Diogo and Carolina and Leticia. Right? They're just faces on a screen. And what's interesting is that the connection is just about as good. So that all of a sudden, this vast distance between here and Sao Paulo has been, been just condensed. This has to be important for the future of everything, but it's important for the future of law and development, because law and development is a global field. If it's not a global field, it's nothing. It's just a bunch of people in America saying, here's how the world ought to run, and the people in Brazil saying, what the fuck are we going to do about this problem? And we're not talking to each other, and we're not being of help to each other. So this is a huge thing that we don't really understand, how we can make use of this. Because it's something like this, it would have cost what? I mean, if I had flown to Sao Paulo to give this lecture, even if I flew economy class, which I don't, and even if I didn't stay in a 5-star hotel, it would have cost USP $3,000, right? And if I didn't charge a penny just for the airfare and that 3 nights in a hotel, 5 nights in a hotel. And it's cost nothing in money. So this has to be part of the future of law and development, managing the potential. So one good thing that the virus has done for us is accelerated the development of this kind of technology. And I just think that it's got all sorts of possibilities that nobody's even begun to think about. But if we're going to manage the crisis, if we're going to be pay more attention to context, level the hierarchy, and reduce the fragmentation, this is the way it's going to happen. Next question.
Ok, thanks, Dave. Humberto, você quer fazer sua pergunta? Facilitar?
Okay, Professor. Professor David, I would like to hear a little more about what can we understand by using that expression, rule of law. Here in Brazil, we use that expression to a lot of meanings. I would say like an umbrella expression to use whatever it takes, and I would like to hear a little more about this. Like in the early law and develop, what sense? Thank you.
I remember vividly how the phrase estado do direito was used in the effort to overturn the dictatorship in the 70s. So it's a political concept to which content can be given, but which doesn't necessarily by itself immediately answer the question, what is its meaning, how does it work, what the rest of it. I think it's a very empty vessel into which many things can be poured, but it's also a symbol of something that is different than what you don't like. So I think that just saying that doesn't answer anything. It forces you to ask a lot of subordinate questions. There's a lot of literature on this. But it means that power must be exercised subject to a variety of rules which have been democratically, in theory, arrived at, and which can be observed and criticized. I mean, that's the simplest. But it carries with it certain liberal notions about individual freedom, limits of state power. It does not have an idea of equality. The rule of law, it has an idea of equality under the law. That is, that everyone must be treated equally, that the law cannot be different for the rich and the poor, and so on. But that's an idea, and in order to make that idea, to see if that idea is actually reality, that's when we get into empirical research, and so you can take the idea, equal treatment under the law, and you can subject that to an empirical study in any particular context, any particular country, any particular area, and you can use that as a starting point for reform. So equality under the law, obedience to power being restricted by law, these are all parts of the idea. I don't know if that's helpful. I've never been too invested in this idea. I've been much more looking more at the pragmatic side of things, and I'm a pragmatist. I think you can look at this pragmatically as well and say, no, it's not some just vague idea. It's a bunch of particular notions about how people should be treated, how legal institutions should work, and those things can be assessed through various forms of research and critique. Right?
Dave, do we have time for two more questions, perhaps three?
I'm going nowhere.
Okay. Ricardo, Vitor,
oh, but I charge extra. After the first hour, my rates go up by 50%. So just remember that.
All right. Ricardo, Vitor e Natália, por favor, façam as 3 perguntas em bloco e depois a gente vai passar a palavra para o professor Trubek para ele responder as 3 e a gente encerra.
So yeah, thank you, David, for having us here. Thank you for your time. I'd like to ask you something about, you said models of law and development trying to reach a certain equality, but I do believe each country has its own some problems about why they're not equal. And when I think about it, it's like I see 3 different stories about globalization. The first is about the Asian countries. They are getting richer, and it is really great because it kind of level the inequality between countries a bit more, but the other side is also the income is growing at such a low rate for the workers class. But by the other side, the 1% more rich, the 0.1% more rich, their rate are raising like skyrocket. And I mean, when I think about equality, I see Norway, I see Japan. They have rules about that, mostly about taxes. Like, you know, when someone in Japan dies and their heritage is not all for their children, mostly goes to the government. I think this is the way for trying to reach better equality. But here in Brazil, we have this inequality since slavery, since that time, and I don't see how one model can work for every country. Each country has to, I don't know, try to find their own model, you know? Even though there's one model up and running, it's a great model, but I don't think it works for everyone, for every country.
Right. I'm sorry.
No, that's all. That's my question.
So first, we agree on one thing: Brazil is not Norway, right? We can start with that. So Norway is a tiny country, ethnically homogeneous, and happens to have a vast amount, well, declining, but still vast amount of oil that it can export, and Brazil has, it's a very different place. I think that okay.
Sorry, if you want me, I can like rephrase the question.
No, that's okay. That's okay. The Asian miracle is the most important story in development in recent years, in recent decades, and China is the big story, although there's the Southeast Asian story as well. The Chinese story is one of immense growth, tremendous elimination of poverty, and great inequality. There's no question about it. China is as unequal as any place right now in terms of income. But on the other hand, millions, hundreds of millions of people have been brought out of poverty by the Chinese experiment. So this is a very complicated story. And the worst case is where you have inequality and poverty, right? So it seems to me that if you want to worry about that, the first thing is to reduce poverty. The second is to do it in a way, if possible, with the least amount of inequality. These are not easy to accomplish, and there are very few stories in recent times where people from outside of the already developed countries have been able to do both, that is, eliminate or significantly reduce poverty and have a rapid development without inequality. So I don't have an answer to that. I think one has to, but I also believe, and I think that it's implicit in your question, and if it isn't, you should add it to your thinking about it.
All right.
There is no one model, and there are no universal rules. So if Brazil wants to try, if you want to figure out a way that Brazil could reduce poverty and do it without, while simultaneously reducing the inequality in Brazil, which is, as you all know, is about as high as it gets, right? Brazil on the Gini scale has very, very high inequality level. You can do it. It can be done because there's no rule that says you can't, but it's a huge act of imagination, organization, and political savvy. But you can't, but you should, if you can take away anything at all from what I've been saying, that's not impossible. It may be difficult. It may be hard to find the right model. I mean, Norway is no model for Brazil. Find some country that's done a better job starting from where Brazil has been, rather than 5 million Norwegians who have all the oil in the North Sea to live I mean, I love Norwegians. Wisconsin, was founded to a large degree by Norwegians, and so a lot. When I started teaching in Wisconsin, there were 7 people on the faculty of Norwegian descent. So I'm a big fan of Norway, but it's not a model for Brazil. It may be a model for Finland, but that's about it. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, David.
You have a couple more, Diogo? I can stay a few more minutes.
Okay, Vitor. Yes, we have a couple of more. Vitor, Natalia, and Leticia, and that's it. Vitor.
Hello, Professor Trubek. Hello? Hello, yeah. Professor. It was a pleasure to hear from you. My question is more like a theoretical one. Were there intersections between the law and development approach and the word system theory of Professor Wallerstein, Higgy? Were there some dialogues between you and these scholars?
Yes, there's a whole bunch of people within the law and development movement who deploy these ideas. So there are people in this world who think of in world systems terms. No names immediately come to mind. I'll try to remember, but the answer is, the short answer to your question is, it has had an influence on some people in this field, and of whom I suppose, well, I mean, although he wouldn't say that he's in the law and development field, he actually came out of the law and development world, and that's Boa Santos. So if there's anybody, and his work has been influential. So he doesn't see himself as law and development as such, but lots of people who do see themselves that way are, influenced. And he is, in the legal world, as far as I know, Boa is probably the person who has been closest to the world systems and used it most thoroughly. By the way, Boa Santos was a fellow of the Yale program in law and modernization that I mentioned, that operated under, and he got a lot of money from AID to study and get a doctorate at Yale. So this goes back a long way, and he was at Yale when I was there, and when we had this program, which was one of the first programs to try to think about where law fit in development. At that time, he was not really. I'm not even sure at that time how much Wallerstein had written. He's just getting started, but the short answer to your question is, anybody who's in law and development today and takes the theoretical side seriously is familiar with Wallerstein and world system theory, and particularly the way Boa Santos has developed it in the law. Whether they agree with that or not, that's a separate question. But it's a live topic and a highly respected intellectual part of any serious law and development scholar's intellectual, architecture baggage.
Thank you, Professor.
Who's next?
Natália, a gente
Can you listen to me now?
Okay, I see.
tentar de novo,
Microphone, my computer wasn't working.
Agora a gente está te ouvindo.
Okay.
Agora sim.
Mr. Trubek, I see that you mentioned the Spau's article on autocratic legalism. So I'm guessing you'd classify Bolsonaro as an autocrat, considering his attacks on legal institutions and pretty much any agency that checks his actions. But would you say, as someone with a foreign perspective, that we could classify him and maybe leaders like Orban, as you mentioned, or even Erdogan as well, as populists as well as autocrats? Or do you think that they fall under another category of leaders, and why?
Okay. Without pretending to be an expert, I would say but I don't know much about Erdogan, but I think that they're all populists. That there is an autocratic strand of populism, but there's a whole debate as to whether populism and autocracy are necessarily connected, and whether populism and democracy are necessarily at odds. And indeed, there is an article that just came out, which I have not read, by Mark Tushnet and Boyan Bugarek, who is part of our autocratic legalism project that Raquel and I are involved in. Bugarek is, not Tushnet. Which analyzes this and comes up with the idea that there are both liberal and autocratic versions of populism. So populism isn't necessary. If you take that seriously, and I don't want to quote an article I haven't read. I literally saw it this morning. It just came out. In Harvard, one of the Harvard journals. But it seems a plausible argument. And I think that certainly the autocratic legalists are populists. You could be an autocrat and not be a populist, but I think those people who are autocratic legalists, who are trying to appear to stay within the constraints of law rather than breaking with the whole system, I think they tend to be populists. But I don't think that all populism is necessarily autocratic. And to that I commend this article, which I tend to agree without having had a chance to read it.
If you could send the article, that would be great, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you could send the article you've just mentioned, I can circulate it.
I'll send you the link. I'll send you the link. I just saw it actually, my wife saw it and brought it to my attention. It must have just been published. I just saw it on one of these, these lists of new articles that come out. I'll send, as soon as we hang up, I'll find it. I'll send it to Diogo. He can send it to everybody.
Thank you. Leticia.
Hi, thank you, Professor, for your talk. It was very interesting, but we've mentioned quite a few articles and quite a few authors. So I would like to ask you if you had to recommend a single book or a single article that you find that brings out the most important and actual, recent questions on law and development. I would really appreciate it. It's basically recommending just the most interesting one or the most, I don't know.
I'm embarrassed because, of course, I'm going to recommend my own article, but I will.
I guess that's fine too.
My article in the Toronto Law Review called Law and Development 40 Years, or Scholars and 40 Years After Scholars and Self-Estrangement. And much of this presentation draws on that I did today, which is sort of a shorter version of a much longer presentation, draws on that article. And I think, although things have changed since then, that article is about 6 years old, but I think that, to me, that's the most comprehensive thing I have done, and I haven't seen anything more recently that addresses law and development as a self-understood field. I mean, there's lots of important stuff about law in developing countries, law in autocratic legalist contexts. There's lots of stuff. The moment you define law and development broadly to include all of this, then that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is, how do we narrow it down to something that's manageable? But maybe I'm trying to hold on to law and development when it's really kind of over, because it's gotten so fragmented that actually what we need is another category to call it. But in any event, if you wanted one thing that I think would be useful, read 40 years after Scholars and Self-Estrangement. Although probably you have to read Scholars and Self-Estrangement first, because you can't understand what it's all about until you read Scholars and Self-Estrangement. It was my article which said, wait a minute, we've been too close to these, we've stuck too close to some of the assumptions of these Cold War government agencies. We need to have a more independent academic field. The problem was that this was a critique of the work done with the financial support of the development agencies, saying that really the academy needs to be more independent of government. But at that time, there wasn't enough support in the academy to keep it going without this external support, because the students weren't interested, and the faculty couldn't see why law and development should be on the curriculum of a law school. What's that got to do with anything? If we're training people to be lawyers in the state of Wisconsin, why should they have to know about Brazil, for God's sake, right? Now, Wisconsin Law School didn't think that way, but a lot of other law schools did. Wisconsin Law School kept it going, even when all the money was no longer there. But much of what was happening was actually driven by this external money, and therefore it took a long time. There was a period after our article which the development agencies were very unhappy with that article, and they stopped giving money to the universities shortly after the article was published. That is not why they stopped giving money. There were many other stronger reasons, but they weren't happy with the article. And therefore, what happened in the field in the United States was it sort of went underground, not literally, but it just wasn't that important. And it wasn't until the economists in the World Bank decided law was important that it became possible to revive the field, but again, dependent on all this external money. However, now I think because of the globalization of universities, the increased flows and communications, greater student interest in the rest of the world, in the United States, it's been possible to get a little bit of autonomy. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. It's now 12:15. I think we better stop here. Thank you so much, Dave, for your keynote, for your participation, and for your talk. It was really a pleasure for us. Obrigado a todos e a todas. Nós nos vemos na próxima terça-feira. Aproveito para apresentar a vocês a professora Raquel Pimenta, que está aqui conosco. Ela é quem vai conduzir as nossas discussões na próxima terça-feira, na próxima aula. Obrigado, Raquel, por estar aqui conosco também. Um prazer. A gente volta a se ver e continua com o nosso curso na semana que vem. Dave, muito obrigado. Um grande abraço para você.
Diogo, I'll send you a link to Scars and Self-Estrangement and to 40 years so that you can just give that to the students, along with the citation to the Tushnet Bugaric article, okay? I'll do that right away.
Okay, I will circulate as soon as I get it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Até já.
Muito obrigado a todas, gente, e a todos. Um abraço.
Obrigada, professor. Tchau.
Obrigado.
Tchau, gente. Boa tarde aí para sempre.